Hello, welcome back to week 3 of the Saint Method Q&A. Apologies that this is a little bit late, but I was actually sick last week, and I don't know if you can hear it a little bit still in my voice, but at one stage I actually lost my voice, so there was absolutely no chance that I was going to be recording the Q&A then. So apologies for the delay, but we're here now. And there is one really good question that we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to get straight into it. So this is from somebody that wanted to talk about emotional eating. So the question, I'm just going to read it out. I actually don't register I've done it until after it's done. I've put my healthy snacks at the front of the fridge and pantry, but that didn't help. I have teenage boys who are super active, so we do have things like brownies, baking, chippies, etc. for them to have, so removing them from the house isn't viable. Normal weekdays, I don't have a problem, but add stress or even just a weekend in, and well, yeah, tips from the experts, please. Which I guess is me. So, okay, first of all, so talking about emotional eating. So why do we turn to food when we are experiencing emotions? And let's be honest, they tend to be the more negative emotions. This is because food provides us with a temporary, note the word temporary, a temporary reprieve from whatever that emotion is that we're feeling. And that is because food can comfort us and soothes us. And this is due to the release of the chemical dopamine in the brain. So there is a real scientific reason as to why we turn to food to help us cope with, in this case, it sounds like it was a bit of stress, but any other emotion. It can be lots of different things: boredom, loneliness, fatigue, being tired, stress. So there are lots of different things that can trigger off the need or desire or want to eat to make yourself feel better. So because of that, if these episodes do happen, and this person has said that they didn't even register it until afterwards, it's good to try and reflect on what was happening in the environment, what was I feeling kind of in the lead up to that moment. And that's important because if we can identify what was going on, then that also helps us to see, can we find an alternative activity that can help deal with that emotion that isn't about food. So having some insight or some reflection as to what was happening in the lead up to the emotional episode will help you to hopefully be able to identify in the future if that is going to happen again and what strategies you can put in place to prevent that from happening again. So, mentioned already in the question, in terms of setting the environment up for success, have done the best that you can. Healthy snacks are there and visible, but obviously the more treat foods, I'm going to say in inverted commas, they have to be in the house because there are other people in the house that are using them. So have done a good job at addressing the environmental issues here, but obviously how can we help in this situation when you cannot take that stuff out of the house? So something that was mentioned in the question that I want to come into is around about the weekends. So in the question said, even just a weekend is something that can trigger off an emotional eating episode. So something that I want to throw out there, over restriction can often lead to overindulging. And this can happen especially on a weekend because weekends tend to be less structured. We also typically tend to start our week on a Monday. So come Saturday, if you have been over restricting yourself during the week, then come the weekend, you might just be really fatigued from that. And there's a bit less structure generally in a weekend, and that can lead to overindulging. So if this is something that you're finding is happening most weekends, have a look back on what have you been consuming during the week. The reason I give you range targets is because I want you to diet on as high calories as you possibly can. I want you to be in a deficit, but I don't want it to be so savage that it feels difficult and it feels like restriction. Because once you get to the weekend, we just begin this big cycle. Over restriction just leads to a loss of inhibition. And come the weekend, that's when it's most likely to come out. And what can happen if that is left uncontrolled is that you can overindulge so much on a weekend that you end up bringing yourself out of the deficit. And this is why people go round and around in circles with dieting. They're super, super strict, and then it all goes out of the window. So what I'm encouraging, and it might sound crazy that somebody is helping you to lose fat, is actually going to encourage you to try and potentially eat more food during the week. If you are finding that you are regularly coming in below the lowest number in the range target that I have given you, ideally I don't want you eating lower than the lowest number I have given you, because that's already a pretty decent calorie deficit. Anything below that, we are definitely starting to look at under where we want to be. So if you can increase your food intake during the week, which I know again sounds crazy, but it just means that when we come to the weekend, because you haven't over restricted yourself that much, you won't have that overwhelming desire to overindulge come the weekend when we do lose some of that structure. So not probably what you were expecting as a strategy, but one that logically, hopefully, will work. Now, the other thing that mentioned in the original question was, again, around the weekends. So planning for a weekend sounds really, really boring. But the reason weekends are hard comparable to during the week is because most of us tend to work during the week. So the weekday is generally quite structured. You get up at a certain time. You have to be here at a certain time. You have this window for eating. So it's quite easy to plan your meals and to just execute your meal plan. When it comes to the weekend, obviously you don't have those same kinds of plans and structures. So even though it sounds really, really boring, actually trying to have a bit of a plan on the weekends as well, and not just let it be a free-for-all, is going to help you stay on track without going over the top. It might be that you plan in freedom. You might decide to have a really structured breakfast, a planned breakfast and a planned lunch, and then allow yourself some extra calories to enjoy something, a drink or two, a treat, a coffee and a cake, whatever it is, whatever you want to do. Actually plan for that. So you're making it almost purposeful. If you wanted to have something a bit more treaty, it is still part of the plan. It's part of the deficit. So that will remove some of that feeling kind of out of control and not realizing that it's going to happen if you kind of planned for it and made it a real purposeful decision. I also want to talk about mindset here because, you can't plan everything. So from a mindset perspective, sometimes you do just really need to have a little bit more discipline with yourself if this is what you want. So empower yourself to say no to people. If someone is offering you something and you really don't want it, just say no. If you really don't want it, just say no. It doesn't really make any difference to them and their lives. So just stick to your guns and do what feels best for you. Something that I've talked about with one of my clients, which works really, really well. If you are in a situation or you're presented with something, I'm going to say it's an ice cream because this exact thing happened to me on the weekend. I went for a walk in St. Heliers and there was an ice cream truck. And their truck was run by Argentinians and they make excellent ice cream. And I'm going to swear, but basically you have to make a decision. Is this thing a fuck yes or is it a no? And if it's not a fuck yes, then it's a no. For me, that ice cream was a fuck yes. I wanted that ice cream and I do not regret having that ice cream. I loved it. It was wonderful. It was totally worth it. Sometimes you might actually have something and it just wasn't really worth it. And I've had conversations with people where they've said, it just really wasn't worth the calories. So if someone offers you something, if it isn't a fuck yes, then it's a no. And that's okay because at this time, you are choosing to say no to things that you don't want because you have your goal. So rather than thinking of this as, I can't have that, I'm not allowed that, that's absolutely not the mindset that I'm encouraging here. You are choosing at this time to make different choices around the food that you eat. And like I said, if something is an absolute fuck yes, have it. And that's okay. But if it's not, don't bother at this time. So this is all your choice. Okay, I just want to finish with something because I know who asked this question, and I also know what the overeating episode was because I can see everything on the food journal. So a word that I want to finish with is catastrophizing. When I saw what the overeating episode was, it wasn't really that much. It would have potentially brought you up to your maintenance calories. And as we know from maintenance, that isn't losing fat, but it's also not gaining fat. At worst, you might have been slightly over your maintenance for that day. But because you've been in a calorie deficit for the rest of the week, you were not over enough to cancel out all of the stuff that you've done. So I encourage people not to catastrophize when these things happen because it's really important what happens next. If you catastrophize and think, oh my God, I've ruined this now. I've ruined it, so I'm just going to keep going now. That's a problem. And that's a really common thing that happens. You think you've ruined everything, so you continue to overeat. The reality is you probably didn't ruin anything, but it's the continued overeating in response to that that is going to cause a problem. So I don't want you to catastrophize if you've had more than you had planned, because at best you were probably at maintenance. At worst, you were slightly over, but not by enough to cancel out your whole calorie deficit. So this is not permission to just go and overeat all the time, every weekend, but I think it is good just to bring it into context and not overthink it and not worry about it too much. So hopefully that has covered that question. I will be back very, very soon for the next Q because I don't have a delay this time. So please let me know if there are any questions that you want me to cover, and I will see you next time.